This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
All right, let's get this out of the way. I need to issue a proper apology. In the run-up to the news, I described the music in the background as a rising crescendo. Daniel and others have been in touch to point out that by its very nature, a crescendo rises. Hashtag fake news. Disgraceful journalism. I apologise. Time now to turn our attention to, it is the same question as the one in the last hour. It's just got a different cast. At least that's the conclusion I arrive at from where I'm sitting. The activist and anti-Kremlin campaigner Bill Browder used to run still does actually run an investment fund, but he used to be the most successful investor in post-communist Russia until his lawyer Sergei Magnitsky was killed in prison by the same authorities that had stolen $200-something million from companies run by Bill Browder. When I first invited him into the studio, was it 5 years ago? It could have been 5 years. I'm counting. You know how I'm working it out? I'm working it out by who was the producer of the programme at the time, not by the actual passage of chronology. So was it about three? It was between 3 and 4 years ago. First time he came in, and I'm going to sound a bit pompous now. Not pompous. That's not quite the word. What's the word when you kind of been a bit grandiose? I'm going to sound a bit grandiose now because in all of my career. And that's already grandiose, if you say a phrase like that, talking about your career as if it's a thing of particular interest. But I'm going to stick with it, because I really mean this. Of all the people I have encountered as a result of being a journalist, he was the one that stopped me in my tracks the most. You know how on this programme we love keys, penny drop moments, light bulbs. We don't find many, but when we do, the only man who made sense of stuff that was going on with regard to Russia and Vladimir Putin, for me, was Bill Browder, which is why I've now interviewed him half a dozen times, at length as well, in various different formats and places. Yesterday, he was absolutely everywhere. He was the go-to man for an explanation of Kremlinology, for an explanation of why Putin behaves in the way that he does, why the so-called Magnitsky sanctions, which would see Putin's cronies punished where it hurts them the most, in the pocket. It was April 2014 when he first came in. So, yeah, nearly 4 years ago. And it was incredible yesterday to sit there, because this is just a little radio show, right? And I don't even know if we were national back. Were we national in 2014? I think we may have only been in London, but either way, we had about, we've got 1 million listeners now. We had about 400,000 back then, if that. Bloke was listening to us in the back of a taxi and thought, this guy seems to be asking questions about Russia that I can answer. Got in touch, cold, phoned up, spoke to the producer. Producer, like me, felt that this was someone who seemed to be really interesting and important. He wasn't unknown. Sergei Magnitsky's murder had been reported. The story was out there. But Bill's actual role in disseminating it, which is his life's work now, he is going to avenge the murder of Sergei Magnitsky. I'm sure he won't mind me telling you that he looks after his widow and his son and plays a similar role in supporting the widow of Alexander Litvinenko through his foundation. The point was this: no one had ever heard of him. And a few people got in touch with me saying he was a crank. A couple of years later, one of these Russian lawyers that has been meeting up with Donald Trump's son starts tweeting criticism of my LBC radio show. And you sort of begin to wonder whether, what's that about? And these strands connect. And to see yesterday the man who unlocked it all for us first 4 years ago, now regarded essentially as the leading authority on precisely the kind of corruption and kleptocracy that leads to the attempted murder of a former spy on the streets of Salisbury, makes, if you followed him and my interviews with him, absolutely perfect sense. It's quite incredible. I don't think that if I do this for another 20 years, I'll ever meet anyone or interview anyone who unlocks complicated issues quite as completely as Bill Browder does. His book Red Notice is out if you want to get hold of it, and you haven't heard my interviews with him. They're available online. But the book Red Notice, it reads like a Hollywood thriller. but it's his actual life. And what he has calculated is that the way... Look, there's one little event, I'll tell you, right? I forget the fella's name off the top of my head, but everybody was frightened of Putin when he came into power because they thought he was going to wash away a lot of the corruption that had allowed a lot of the oligarchs to amass huge amounts of money. So the key oligarch, the richest oligarch in the country at the time, got off his plane in Siberia and got arrested. And this was a huge shock. It sent shockwaves throughout Russia, throughout the world, actually, because by now the markets were opened up and there was a lot of Western investment in these utilities and in these companies. But they arrested the richest man in Russia. His name will come to me in the course of the next couple of minutes. And they put him on trial for corruption in a cage in Moscow. That's not unique in the annals of Russian jurisprudence, but it plays on television like you wouldn't believe. So they put the fella in a cage in Russia on trial for corruption, and every oligarch in the country was on the phone to the Kremlin immediately asking for a meeting with Vladimir Putin. And when they had those meetings, Vladimir Putin said very simply to them, I want half of everything. That's why he is now the richest man in the world. And his greatest fear is not being able to get his hands on that money, because the money disappears if he loses power. It was Mikhail Khodorkovsky is the name of the man that was put on trial first. And in the early moments of that intervention, the early moments of that arrest, they all, I nearly said something awful there, they all wet themselves, we'll go with, because they thought, crikey, he is going to clamp down on corruption. But he didn't. It was like a Jeffrey Archer short story. When they went to see him to ask, what can we do to avoid Khodorkovsky's fate? The answer was, give me half. Give me half of everything. And when the people find out, well, then you get scenes like you saw in Ukraine. When the people find out how much the leader has stolen from them, you get scenes like the ones you saw in Ukraine, which, of course, the Kremlin spin machine portrayed over here. It's the beginning of Brexit, in a way, that the European Union are camped out at the Russian border. No wonder they're supporting the... No wonder they're supporting the rebels. But it was simple. The Ukrainian people found out how much money the leader, Chenko, forgotten his name as well. Mind like Swiss cheese today. I should really think this stuff out in advance, shouldn't I, before I start sharing it with you? And that's why it happened. So then you have the sociopathic tendencies that the man clearly possesses, which will explain why he cannot allow a perceived betrayal to go unpunished. The man who was poisoned in Salisbury this week, his son and wife have already died in mysterious circumstances. His daughter is in hospital as well. There are various names on a list, an investigation undertaken by BuzzFeed that brings in British business people. All of these people have died in mysterious circumstances. And the investigations... His wife died of cancer, but there's suspicion about how the carcinogens entered her system. All of the evidence is that Russian spies are operating with borderline impunity, not just on behalf of the Russian government, but on behalf of the Russian kleptocracy, so on behalf of the people who possess the money, of which half has been given to Putin. And they've got so much money. They've got so much yacht. They've got enough to buy football clubs. They've got enough to buy super yachts. They've got enough to buy Knightsbridge. They've got enough to buy houses that cost more than you and me combined would earn if we lived to be 504. And right-wing politicians, and to a degree left-wing politicians, free marketeers, I suppose you'd say, so it could be Peter Mandelson or it could be George Osborne, they love the money. They love it. In fact, if you made a bunch of money in Russia, you can come and buy a newspaper. Oh, and if you buy a newspaper, you could hire George Osborne to edit it. Still with me? So when we see stories like the one unfolding in Salisbury at the moment, and we wonder what we can do in response, and we put the nation's clown-in-chief Boris Johnson up in the House of Commons late for an urgent question addressing his own department, late for his own urgent question, Boris Johnson, John Bercow quipped that perhaps he'd been held up at the Islington-Camden border. So now Boris Johnson's dishonesty and absurdity is just a sort of soft national joke rather than a national actual shame, which of course it is. When we ask what can we actually do, I think the answer might be naffle, unless we're prepared to tell them to take their money and naff off. But
this is LBC. This is LBC with James O'Brien. Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850.
80 minutes after 11. Just a little brief word of housekeeping. I gesticulate, as you'll know if you've seen any of the video clips that come out of the programme, quite wildly sometimes while I'm talking to you. But I also have a couple of gesticulations that are designed to let my colleagues know that it's time to go to the break, or it's time to... I don't do the faders myself, so that they can decide whether or not a conversation should continue rather than me. Makes things a lot more fruity and interesting. If you do the faders yourself, you can cut people off whenever you want. Leave it to your colleagues, and sometimes if you're getting hung out to dry by a caller, they'll make sure that the bit starts squeaking. It's my choice, I should stress. But my colleague Jakob mistook one of my rhetorical flourishes for the finger pointing that normally tells him to go to the break, which is why it appeared that the Kremlin had intervened in my description, my absolutely incontrovertible and unassailable description of how Vladimir Putin's Kremlin works. As you will know if you've listened to the programme for years, that interview of Bill Browder, which we've just put up again, the old LBC one up on the website, is why none of this surprises. And it also explains why he needs so desperately to sow division and unrest in Western democracies, because his retention of power hinges upon portraying Western democracies as chaotic and corrupt. You get Donald Trump into the White House, it's job done. You can't get much more chaotic and corrupt than that, which is why Putin put so much effort into achieving it. European Union, largest single market in the world, most powerful trading bloc on the planet, hates it. So he'll do everything he can to break it up. Mission accomplished. June 2016. So all of that is, I'm afraid, on the page marked fact, not opinion. What is opinion is the question of how we respond. So Boris Johnson stood up in the House of Commons yesterday, late for his own urgent question, and addressed the issue of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia, who remain critically ill in hospital. And MI5 now operating very much on the presumption that it was undertaken by, I would have to say, Russian spies. It looks like what they call a state-sponsored assassination, that state being Russia. It's also been reported today that the death of his wife last year in 2012 from cancer, and his son in St. Petersburg will also be considered part of the Metropolitan Police investigation. The question then becomes, what can we do? What can we do? And Boris Johnson suggested, in his usual cack-handed way, that we should pull out of the World Cup, and then he pretended afterwards that he just meant the officials, or that Prince William shouldn't go. But that's what happens when you put hecklers on the stage, is that they try to turn heckles into the full act. So you end up with a clown like Boris Johnson somehow claiming responsibility for the national response to a state-sponsored assassination. Be careful what you wish for, peeps. Seriously, because that's what we've got now. We've got a professional clown in charge of our, yesterday at least, in charge of our response to that state-sponsored assassination. If you want to know how effective Boris Johnson is as a Foreign Secretary protecting the interests of British people, ask one called Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. She'll give you chapter and verse on exactly how effective a diplomat and a politician he is on the international stage. But oddly, despite considering Boris Johnson to be the most ridiculous and dangerous human being in Parliament, there is some sort of sense in his silliness. We can't pull out of the World Cup, I don't think, and I'm not even sure if we did that we are punishing Russia. I don't know, actually. I'd quite like to touch on the football side of things in this hour. If we pulled out of the World Cup, it would be an act of almost unparalleled moral rectitude. The Americans pulled out of the Olympics in 1984, did they, because of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan? It's when Alan Wells won the sprint, some say because the Americans weren't there. And then, did the Russians pull out after the American invasion of Afghanistan? If you think I was going mad in the last hour when I said they're all the same as each other, look at that. You get the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, so the Americans pull out the Olympics, and then a couple of decades later you get an American invasion of Afghanistan. But leave that by the by for now. If we pulled out of the world, because we're going to send members of the royal family to Russia who have sponsored the assassination of various people in Britain. It's insane, right? The notion of there being a moral compass anywhere involved in any of this is utterly, utterly laughable. But if we were going to punish Russia for assassinating people on the streets of Britain, how would we do it? 0345 6060 973. And I'll take anything on this. I don't want you to feel that you need to have a full and frank understanding of Anglo-Russian relations. What would work best? If we said we weren't going to the World Cup, I'd feel that I was getting punished for the actions of Vladimir Putin's regime. I won't be able to watch my team in the World Cup because they've been killing people in Salisbury and London. I don't know. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you think it does fit. The punishment does fit the crime. Let's find out. Let's get the phone lines open. I'm sorry, that's even by my standards a particularly long introduction, but oddly it is a subject that I know a little bit more about than most people do because I've been on this crash course since I first met Bill. James is in Amsterdam. James, what would you like to say?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, you're quite right, James, to say there's not much we can do given that we've already done a lot against Russia in terms of sanctions and sports bans and all of that. But I would say the first thing we ought to be looking at is where was the UK security services to protect this double agent? I mean, no one's even talked about that.
Well, no, mate, it's an investigation. You can't. It's not. We can't start fingering our own spooks at this point for not protecting him better until we know whether or not they were actually protecting him and they failed, or whether or not he was considered to be safe. It was the Moscow Olympics in 1980 that the Americans boycotted. Just to clarify that. And we're doing a bit with sanctions, but it means that you had people competing at the Winter Olympics under an independent flag rather than the Russian flag, but they were still there, the ones that could prove they were clean. How can you describe that as an effective sanction when they're hosting the World Cup later this year?
Well, I mean, let's get things sorted out. I mean, clearly the World Cup was decided years ago before a lot of these atrocities were done. And, you know, many things...
Litvinenko was already dead.
Yeah, but you can't go on about historical issues when the UK's also done some silly things in the past, but you've got to stop sometime and have some cooperative...
do you know what rule I'd have? I'd say if his widow is still alive, then it's not a historical issue that should be just consigned to the wastebasket of history, pal. That would be my theory.
Yeah, it's one life, you know, Britain's bigger than one life. I mean, that's why we're bringing over MBS this week or today. We've got to consider things in wider perspective. But we also have to have a foreign minister who talks facts. Boris yesterday, if you read his statement, said, I say the governments around the world that attempt to take innocent life on UK soil will not go unsanctioned. This spy was not innocent. He was a convicted double agent.
Under Putin's account, that's a valid point, of course. Putin said at the time of his release, it was part of a prisoner swap, that he would kick the bucket. These people will kick the bucket. The daughter, though, becomes innocent. I don't know. I give Boris the benefit of the doubt. I think I'm allowed to give Boris the benefit of the doubt, given that I castigate him so roundly on a regular basis. I don't know that he misspoke there, or that he was in any way sort of imputing the innocence of the man, because under British law he was guilty of no crime. You can't tell foreign governments that they can come here and kill people who've committed crimes against their regimes, because then we cease to be a place of asylum for the decent people under all sorts of nasty despots. Anton is in Swindon. Anton, what's going on?
Yeah, hi there. Thank you for taking my call. Actually, I'm Russian myself, and kind of monitoring quite closely what's going on around this spy assassination. So I'm not quite clear why there is so much attention on this event. So actually, it looks to me like an internal Russian business. It's one Russian spy, or let's say presumably a Russian spy, killed another Russian spy. So why there is so much...
well, I think very simply, when you're in Swindon, do you live by British laws or Russian laws?
Well, it's British laws, yeah.
Well, there's your answer, Anton.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
I can explain you. Okay, about me, yes, that's correct, yeah. But
so Sergei Skripal, a servant of this nation, lives under British laws in this nation, with his daughter in this nation, and an attempt upon their lives, whoever it is undertaken by, is a matter of security and legality and law for this nation. I mean, I'm struggling to see what's confusing about this, Anton.
Well, confusing that these people, I mean, including Skripal, they made a choice at some point of their time to live outside of legal field, yeah? So
No. They defected so that they could live out. Same reason you're here, because it's better than Russia.
I mean, let's not talk about myself, yeah. But when he joined...
you are kind of the answer to your own question. You are here because Britain is better than Russia, and you expect to abide by British laws, not Russian laws, while you live here, which means if you get murdered, even if it's by another Russian, it's our business, mate.
All right. Okay. So we all understand why Skripal was looking for refuge in the UK. Yeah, because he
wasn't looking for refuge. He was coming home after operating on our behalf in incredibly dangerous circumstances. This would be his ideological and political home because he's an enemy of the kind of oppression undertaken by people like Putin, whether during his days in the KGB or his days at the head of the world's biggest kleptocracy.
All right. Okay.
What else can I help you with?
He was not a KGB agent. Yes,
no, Putin was.
KGB. No. Okay, Putin. Skripal was working.
Because I said in his days, Putin's days as a KGB agent or as the head of the world's biggest kleptocracy. So I'm obviously talking about Putin, unless you're aware of Sergei Skripal's past as the head of the world's biggest kleptocracy.
Sorry, James.
That's all right. It's not your first language.
No. So what I'm trying to say, he was selling. He actually compromised a few dozens of Russian agents.
And protected a few dozen British ones, which is why we look after him.
Okay, so how do you know if he protected?
No, how do you know he compromised Russian ones? It's almost as if you think he deserved to die because you're loyal to Russia despite living in Swindon.
No, what I'm trying to say, that there was a lot of illegal activities before he took a refuge in the UK. Yeah, so
doesn't matter, mate. It doesn't matter. He's under the jurisdiction of British law. So we're back to where we started this conversation. As you live your life in Swindon, do you live by British legal frameworks? Do you live by British laws, or do you get to live by Russian laws?
All right. Okay. All right. Okay. That's fine. No, yeah. It was. I totally agree. It's a legal act. Yeah, but the job people chosen is to work outside of legal field, including MI6 agents, yeah? So because there is a bribery act, they were paying money for a certain piece of information, so they definitely committed...
But you're going around in another circle. You're saying that because he lived the life of a spy, he deserves to die.
No, I'm not saying he deserves...
You're saying, why is everyone so interested in it? It's just a small matter of internal Russian business. That was the phrase you used.
Okay, if you open a criminal news from yesterday. Yeah, there was a number of murders. Yeah, there was a murder of a woman in Twickenham. There was a family found dead in, I think it's Suffolk. Yeah, so there are a lot of illegal murdering activities.
No, but this is. I think we've identified the problem, and I'm late for the news. I apologise. All murders are illegal, Anton, and I guess growing up in Russia, I can genuinely, and this will sound a little bit patronising, I can understand how you've arrived at the conclusion that some murders are legal and some murders aren't. They all are, and in Britain they all get investigated equally according to the crime, not according to the past of the victim. It's called equality before the law. And the sooner you get it in Russia, the safer the world will be. 11:31 is the time. Simon Conway has the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 11:37. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'll stick an if in front of this for the easing of the question process. So if it turns out, as I think everybody accepts it did with Alexander Litvinenko, the attempt upon the life of Sergei Skripal can be traced all the way back to the Kremlin. Is there anything in the modern world? This is the thing about being a proper patriot, actually loving your country, but not in a way that invites you to despise or look down on people who've come from somewhere else. It's about behaviour, not about the content of your heart. So the last fella who didn't really understand what equality before the law means, that's because he grew up in Russia. If he'd grown up in Swindon, he'd understand what equality before the law means, and hopefully he'll stay here for long enough to come around to what I would loosely describe as a Western value with regard to equality before the law, which is why if you get murdered in this country, we should all expect the same treatment from the authorities in the legal system. But I'll put an if there, because it makes the question more chilling. If it turns out that we are subject to another state-sponsored assassination attempt at the moment, thank God, they're both still with us, Yulia Skripal, 33 years old, what can we do? See, if you really want to upset Vladimir Putin, the best thing we could do in this country at the moment would be to reverse the Brexit vote. How's that going to work? when you've got people chomping up and down claiming that it's the best thing since sliced bread. I want to go back to paying roaming charges in the European Union. I'm delighted that America, that country that was going to offer us a big deal to make up for Brexit, I'm delighted they're sticking tariffs on British steel and telling us that we can't have the same open skies agreement that we currently enjoy with them as members of the European Union. We've got people up and down the country claiming that they love punching themselves in the head on a daily basis. So what can we do? If Vladimir Putin is ordering spies to come here and kill people who are supposed to be enjoying the protection of British law, what can we do? Answer? Hit them in the pocket. Problem? Degree of reluctance to do that, although some of the Magnitsky sanctions have been enacted here and in Canada most recently, and Latvia. Now, in the last hour of the programme, you heard the beginning of this dark justice case that we've been following very closely, or rather my colleague Martin Lindsay has been following very closely. Within moments, mere moments, if you didn't hear it, there's a video and you can check it out again on lbc.co.uk. Within moments of putting a profile online that was essentially posing as a 13-year-old girl, they were bombarded with both disgusting suggestions and images, live webcam footage. I should warn you, actually, if you've got the kids in the car, some of this is pretty grim. It's pretty grisly, but in the context of us describing an investigation into online grooming and paedophilia, you probably knew that already, but belt and braces. And within moments of that profile appearing, you heard in the last hour a man called Brian got in touch with Callum and Scott in their guise as a 13-year-old girl who repeatedly stressed her age. They're joining us in the studio in the next hour, but this is, if you will, chapter 2 of the story that Martin Lindsay has been telling.
As soon as we spot him, I'll give it a quick walk past to see if it's definitely him, no mistaken identity and whatnot.
We're now approaching Exhibition Park in the heart of Newcastle city centre. Once we're parked up, Callum and Scott will come up with a plan. It's vital they get their preparation right, or their cover could be blown.
So what happens now? We've got 40 minutes till he's meant to arrive. What do you do?
Mental preparation, innit, and just being sort of like aware of your surroundings and stuff. Luckily, we've been to this entrance before to catch another person.
Your adrenaline starts going. That's why some people are not built for this work. It's emotional and whatnot, but you can't let your emotions get in the way of you sometimes.
We're just walking to the front of the park now on a busy morning in the city centre, and we're just yards away from Newcastle University and the RVI hospital. People are everywhere, going about their normal everyday business, and no one suspects a thing.
Yeah, well, it is. It's your average Friday morning. I mean, you can see people jogging, people going past on their bikes, you know, just going about their daily lives. People don't think that this is going to happen, you know what I mean? Like, no one's going to be sitting there thinking, right now there's someone going somewhere to meet a child. You know what I mean? But they are, and we're here waiting for them.
And then, earlier than planned, Brian has texted to say he's arriving.
People don't think that this goes on. They don't think it's happening, but I mean...
He's been here apparently, so I'm going to look under that bridge, see if he's standing there just out the rain.
Well, Callum has now returned, and we think we've spotted Brian just over the road in front of us. We now need to get closer to make sure it is actually him before we approach.
Basically walking across the road now, over the other side of the road, you see him with a walking stick.
Yeah.
That could be him, but I'm not sure.
We think Brian suspects something. There's no young girl here, and he's now starting to walk away.
We're just following him because it's that running over. It's not him.
We're just checking the photograph on Callum's phone, which confirms it is definitely Brian. We now need to challenge him on why he was planning to meet a 13-year-old girl here for sex.
Excuse me? Can I have a word with you, please? Just want to wait here. Police are on the way.
Why?
Eh? What? For attempting to meet a child following sexual grooming. Yes, Brian.
No.
Yes.
No.
From an organisation known as Dark Justice, yeah?
Right, yeah. Well, I've been having a laugh with you. I know what you're going to bring up. I've been having a laugh with you, but I'll vote.
Been having a laugh? Is this a laugh?
Callum then shows Brian the naked photograph he took of himself and then sent to the decoy profile.
My colleagues wouldn't believe that's a laugh, would they?
Oh, no, well.
Wouldn't he not?
True. That's true.
Would they believe that's a laugh?
That's true, no.
Would my colleagues in the police believe that's a laugh?
That's true. Oh, I won't run away, pal. No, I couldn't run to save myself. You're not going to get far anyway. No, I couldn't run to save myself.
Brian is now apprehended while his family are in the hospital behind us. Now they call the police.
We've got him,
Just in case you do.
He's came to meet what he thinks is a 13 or 14-year-old girl following sexual grooming.
God, I feel sick now. I feel horrible. I don't know why it come because I knew in my mind.
Well, yeah, of course you did. Because right at the beginning, when you first wanted to meet, you talked about the police, didn't you?
Yeah, I knew.
20 minutes then pass and Brian gets an unexpected phone call.
Was that your wife ringing you there?
Yes.
Why didn't you answer?
Because he's out his nuts here. She divorces me, man, so what would she want to help? She wouldn't help me, you know.
Brian's life is falling apart minute by minute. He's physically shaking and has to sit down. The police then arrive with blue flashing lights on the top of the car.
He's come to meet a child following sexual grooming.
Two officers, one wearing a stab vest, approach Brian and empty his pockets, taking away his mobile phone, which is full of evidence. Brian's arrested and walked to the police car flanked by the officers. The next time we'll see him is at Crown Court, charged with trying to meet an underage girl following sexual grooming.
That's it now, like.
Job done.
Well, it's another one down, innit, you know what I mean? And now it's on to the next ones.
Scott and Callum will be joining me shortly after 12. I haven't checked with them yet, but I've met them before. They're solid lads. I'm pretty sure that they'll take your calls if you want to ask them something. That's the conclusion of the investigation that Martin Lindsay followed from beginning to end, from literally the ping on the profile of a 13 or 14-year-old girl right through to a guilty plea in Newcastle Crown Court last week. And they do it out of a sense of duty more than anything else. There is no doubt in my mind that this is a grey area, both legally and morally, and I began covering these issues very much from the point of view that vigilantism was always wrong. But I wonder, and I've changed my view largely as a result of my dealings with dark justice, but I wonder if you could look me in the eye and say that you would prefer a world where they didn't do what you just heard them do in that film. We'd perhaps all prefer a world in which it was being done on an industrial scale by the properly invested authorities and forces of law and order, but it isn't. So in the world we currently inhabit, can you look me in the eye and tell me that you'd rather they weren't doing what they just did? Because I can't. Even though I know I couldn't do it myself, I'd be sick to my bones. And I fear for their health. Anyway, you can meet them after 12. And if you've got a question you'd like to put to them, don't feel that you have to. I've got plenty to talk to them about myself, and you know how to get in touch. Theo will be with us in an hour to bring us up to speed with what has gone on at PMQs. And we'll take a couple more calls on, speaking of the world we live in now, rather than the world we'd rather live in. I think there's 4 current members of the American security services, the American intelligence, serving current officials in US intelligence who've said that it's possible to say with high to moderate confidence that assassinations had been carried out on Putin's command. This is American intelligence linking 14 UK deaths recently to Russia. This is the BuzzFeed article that I tweeted and referred to yesterday while speaking to Bill Browder. There's also, in this article, proper reporting of Theresa May's personal intervention as Home Secretary to delay the public inquiry into Alexander Litvinenko's death, citing what she called the need to protect international relations with Russia. And then the other case, the Perepelichny case, the government has been shown to have withheld sensitive evidence from the inquest on national security grounds. So when Boris Johnson stands up and bloviates about pulling out of the World Cup, what he's really doing is covering up for the fact that Putin can kill people on the streets of Salisbury and London and elsewhere with absolute impunity because his cronies are spending so much money here, we daren't lay a finger on them.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:52 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we've barely had time to get stuck into some of the other stories unfolding, as we have a Middle Eastern despot making his way to the palace and a Russian president killing or attempting to kill people in Britain with apparent impunity. It's easy to take your eye off the ball of domestic matters, but there is a fascinating episode unfolding in the House of Commons later, in which I'm going to read you what the Times say, because I think increasingly the Times, despite being owned by Rupert Murdoch, it is the paper of record in this country. The Daily Telegraph's gone absolutely nutsoid over the last few years. But the Times reports this story thus. Ministers will try to block a change in the law that would reveal the details of a £425,000 donation used to fund Brexit adverts in the EU referendum campaign. The money was given to the Democratic Unionist Party. Crikey. It's almost like all roads lead to the DUP at the moment. But most was spent outside Northern Ireland on a national advertising campaign in support of Vote Leave. Had the money been given to the Vote Leave campaign, its origin would have had to be declared. But under Northern Irish election law, dating back to the Troubles, it was allowed to be given in secret. Ben Bradshaw is a leading supporter of the Open Britain campaign and, of course, the Labour MP for Exeter. He joins me on the line from Millbank now. Ben, I read out the Times coverage of this because I wanted to at least start the conversation devoid of political affiliation or, indeed, referendum loyalties. Why are you so keen to find out where this money came from? Or is it a bigger belief that the law needs to be backdated to before the referendum?
Well, I think the Times report you just read out was accurate, and I think your listeners will be able to make up their own minds about what it all means. But as far as I'm concerned, this is a pretty scandalous state of affairs, where we have this very large donation that came through the DUP to the Leave campaign from a rather shadowy organisation called the Constitutional Research Council, which is basically a one-man band in Scotland, and the one man doesn't seem to have any obvious source of wealth to come up with that money. And the public is not being allowed to know the source of that money, as we would be allowed if the money had come in any other way apart from through a Northern Irish party. Now, the government has the opportunity to backdate the law. It is now, from now on, going to make all political donations in Northern Ireland transparent. That, as you rightly say, this goes back to the Troubles, where a lot of the funding of political parties in Northern Ireland was related to paramilitary activity, and lives could be at risk if the sources of money were revealed. But it's refusing, in the face of opposition from the Independent Electoral Commission, from all the political parties at Westminster and every political party in Northern Ireland apart from the DUP, to make this retrospective, as it has powers to do, which would include donations made during the EU referendum.
Just forgive me, I've gone off on a bit of a mad tangent. If power sharing had been re-established, could anything have happened in Stormont to influence this?
No, this is a Westminster.
No, I appreciate that. I just wondered whether, when you mentioned that it's all the other parties except the DUP, whether this would add yet another sinister layer to that breakdown of negotiations.
No, not really. And we all know how critical DUP support is for the survival of the current government, and the DUP clearly don't want the source of this money to be made public. The Electoral Commission, to be fair to them, is investigating this, and they would very much like to make public where this money came from, but the law doesn't allow them to.
Do they know?
I don't know whether they do know. You'll have to ask them.
I will.
They know that it came from the Constitutional Research Council, but I'm not clear that they have the power to ask the Constitutional Research Council because of the Northern Ireland situation, where they got the money from. And for me, this isn't about being anti or pro Brexit. This is about the integrity and transparency of our electoral system and our political donation system. And I think for the public to have confidence in that system, it's important that the people know who is funding our politics. And as you know, there are lots of allegations floating around where money might have come from in the referendum campaign, and I think those allegations will not be put to bed until we have full transparency.
In the absence of being able to ask them myself, I'd invite you to speculate. So the question, it seems to me, if I've understood you correctly, Ben Bradshaw, breaks down into two parts. The first is, if they weren't so reliant upon the DUP for their parliamentary majority, do you think the government would be working so hard to keep this secret? And the second is, their defence will be, we are simply applying the law. The law is changing, and you want to retrospectively sort of backdate a change in the law. Is there any possible case just for arguing that they're speaking in good faith? It's not specific to this DUP donation. This 425 grand has nothing to do with it. They'll just say, we never backdate laws.
No, because under the actual existing legislation, ministers have the power to make this retrospective to 2014, and they are actively choosing not to do so.
So then back to the first question, which is, do you think they'd be doing that if the DUP weren't apparently so keen to keep this quiet?
Well, clearly their dependence on the DUP for their parliamentary majority must be playing a role here. But, I mean, all the way along, as you may know, I've been campaigning campaigning on trying to uncover some of the other sources of funding for the Leave campaign during the Brexit referendum. And every step of the way, the government has done what it can to put obstacles in our way. We've got the Electoral Commission inquiries, we've got the Select Committee inquiry into alleged Russian influence, and we've of course got the American investigation into all of that. And every step of the way, the government has been very resistant in being open and honest about funding and who was paying for various aspects of the Leave campaign. And my conclusion is that they just simply don't want to do anything or expose anything that could cast doubt on the legitimacy of the result.
And we shall have to watch this space. Have you got a chance of winning?
That depends on whether any principled Conservatives who feel a bit uncomfortable about how cosy they are with the DUP and who are not very keen on Theresa May's hard Brexit are prepared to vote with us. I somehow doubt it, but I hope they do, and then we may find out where this money came from.
And until then, we shall, I suppose, watch with bated breath. Before you go, Ben Bradshaw, you mentioned Russia. I suggested all roads lead to the DUP. That's clearly not true. Some lead to Moscow, but I think that covers pretty much all of them in British politics at the moment. How do you I'll ask you the question I've been asking my callers. If, as seems likely, this is the latest example of a state-sponsored assassination attempt on British soil, is there anything we can do as a sovereign nation to, quotes, punish, end quotes, Russia?
Yes, two very clear things. London is the centre of the money laundering of dirty Russian money related to Putin's corrupt regime. There have been no prosecutions. The government and our prosecution agencies have been completely hopeless and weak when it's come to that. The second thing, very important piece of legislation is coming to Parliament in the next few weeks, the so-called Magnitsky Bill, which will make it much easier for the government here to sanction individuals in the in the Kremlin regime and their associates who are guilty of crimes or corruption. And the government has so far been resistant to, or in spite of pressure across the House, including from Tory MPs, to accept that legislation. I hope that this means that they will.
Ben Bradshaw, the Labour MP for Exeter, and as he mentioned, a leading supporter of the Open Britain campaign. Many thanks indeed for your time. £425,000, which I think we can say mysteriously made its way into Vote Leave's coffers via this slightly obscure one-man band in Scotland. And of course, if the money had come via other channels, they would have been legally bound to reveal its sources. Genuinely, this is why I read the Times coverage out, because I don't want this to be flavoured by how you voted in the referendum. How could you not care about where this money came from? So it spent a six-figure sum, £425,000 spent on seeking to influence our votes in a really important referendum. And the government don't want you to know where the money came from. Curiouser and curiouser.
On FM, online, on your mobile and on digital radio. Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.